Ahoy, everyone. This is David Perry with my continuing series of interviews with colleagues, clients, and in this case, writers around the world, specifically writers who have been influential with my work on my novel, Upon This Rock. And for the first of our Meet the Author series, I'm delighted to be in the Zoom room with a dear friend and colleague, fellow author, Linda Frank. Linda, welcome.
Thank you, David. It is a pleasure, and I'm happy to be your kickoff act, your
There
lead
you
act,
go. Well, I have in my hand now three works by you and your talented hand. After the auction,
right?
The Last Torah of Shanghai, which was the first one that I became aware of. And then this newest one, which I haven't read, The Nice Little Blonde Girl. So talk to us about, in general, the overarching theme of these novels, and when did you start writing?
Well, the overarching theme is Jewish history related, mostly 20th century, very engaged with Holocaust kinds of situations. And the first one after the auction came out in 2010, I started writing it probably 5 years before. And but I started thinking about it and the framework for it and the raison d'etre for it and for what turned out to be the series many years before, based on a story that my mother had told me about a businessman her father had met through business during the war. And he seemed very interesting. He had been an art collector. He had come from Poland, where my grandfather also had been born. And he had a lot of art looted from his Warsaw mansion that he sort of just left right before the invasion of Poland in 1939. He was part of the Polish government in exile in London, an honorary consul, which was very unusual for a Jewish man. And then he came to New York and settled there in 1940, and seemed to apparently be running back and forth across the ocean when nobody was. My grandfather was in a business that did work for the war, manufactured for the war, and this man came to Milwaukee to meet him. And in New York, my grandfather was on a business trip. This man took him to what were known as secret meetings, which my grandfather never revealed to my grandmother and my mother before he died, really shortly after the war. And we think he got my grandfather involved in smuggling illegal arms to Palestine for the War of Independence. But the reason my grandfather really cultivated the relationship was because my grandfather had three sisters and their families that after a certain point he never heard from. And he was hoping that this man with his connections could trace them, help him trace them. And that to this day has not really happened in our family. But what amazed me is that when I dug into this man a little bit, this started maybe the 70s or the 80s. He had died, I think, in 1976. His widow was still alive and living in Palm Beach. They had some of their Judaica and other artwork auctioned off by Sotheby's and other known houses. And some of the auctions had started as early as 1950 or 51. And I thought, how did a guy that left everything behind, in Europe in 1939 amass enough to start having these valuable auctions? Is it the good news and the bad news? And I remember going to a gallery in New York where Judaica, Jewish ritual items were on sale, very lovely antique ones, and mentioning his name, and everybody clammed up. And I could never find that much about him. And this was before the internet. And so eventually it occurred to me to just make it up, fictionalize it. And really the first one is based on my fictionalized deal with the devil that the character resembling him may or may not have done. But stranger things have happened. They've taken the shape as mysteries with a character I've branded as the Jewish Miss Marple because I'm such an Anglophile. And that was really because I felt it was very hard to write in the voice of what then would have been a 96-year-old man. And a lot of people think my main character, Lily resembles somebody they know a little bit. But anyway, and then it just sort of took off.
That's what happens to we authors. Alfredo and I were walking this morning with someone said, so is there any relationship between Alfredo and the character of Adriano? I said, you're going to have to read the book. I mean,
Right.
I forget which author it is who said, I think it was John Updike, only write what only you can write. So of course, there's a little bit of Linda Frank in all of your characters, including the Jewish Miss Marple. What is your favorite thing about writing about a historical period? Because as you know, in my book, Upon This Rock, I also delve into real history, both the 16th century and the Vatican and the Medici Pope, but also World War II and current history in Orvieto. For me, it's the research that I find most enjoyable. What is it about writing historical fiction that you like?
I totally agree. I love the research. I love reading nonfiction history. I much prefer reading nonfiction to lots of novels. But I have a book club for the novels that are so-so. I love the research. I love reading about the periods I love reading about. And I also love and feel very fortunate, like you, to have been able to do some of the travel to back up the research. And, it's taken, as you know, I've gone to China many times because I have family there. I have, been in New York many times, London, Israel, where the first book mostly takes place, and the first and second, but the third book, we actually also went to Ukraine. And because it was the first time I was writing something where I had never been. And I want it to be authentic. And my other grandfather did come from there. And this story is based on a story in my family.
Well, there is something I believe about the power of place. I mean, literally, I would not have written this book any place else other than Orvieto. The story found me. Do you go to the places because you want to write there, or when you were there, the idea came to you?
I go to the places to back up what I'm writing. Ukraine was really almost one of the last steps, although I was still very much in the process of writing. But partly because this is based on a family story, and partly because the original storyteller in my family of this story is a cousin who lives, a much older cousin who lives in Israel, had told me where she lived, where the family lived, and I really I just felt I had to see it. And even in that same trip, we went again to Italy. That was the trip when we also went for a magical few days to Orvieto, during which we implemented so many of your wonderful suggestions. But we went to Rome on that trip too. And I had been to Rome before. And actually there's a little bit of Rome in the first book. But I really wanted to pinpoint, where the bishop lived, that there was a restaurant next door. If you haven't read the book, I wanted to pinpoint it, and I wanted to bring in the Italian part because it's related to Vatican and purported Vatican collaboration, with the war with the Nazis and expediting the escape of some Nazi war criminals, out of Europe after the war. But I wanted a place. I have found Lily's apartment building on Central Park. And, I pinpoint every time we've been to New York since, we say, well, isn't Lily going to have us in for a drink? And that's really been important to make it authentic. And, she's a swimmer, as I am. And so every place they go, they try to find, as I do, some place to swim, a pool. And I've pretty much been to all those pools. And it's just important to me, to make it authentic. And, that somebody would know that there's this salmon colored apartment building sort of behind, where you go way behind instead of going to the Vatican Museum. The whole area behind it is the neighborhood that I used, and we walked it.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I've said many times that nothing would make me happier than to be in Orvieto and see someone with my book and trying to find the places. And
right.
For me, the accurate description of places is so important. I remember one day Alfredo teased me because I had to rewrite a chapter, and he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, because I had the sun rising there, and it doesn't rise there." And he said, "Well, you're the only person that would know that." I was like, "But no, I
Know that.
will know it." I want to talk to you a little bit about China. I mean, your son has lived and worked there for a long time. I know in the last few months, because of COVID, he's come back to the United States. And I also know there's a lot of things that he cannot talk about because of his work. But suffice it to say that you and your family are intimately connected to China. Talk to me a little bit about that and about how that real life influence impacted the work, especially the Lost Torah of Shanghai.
Well, he has been in China. He started going as a student in 1995 for a year, but he has been there full time consecutively since 1999, as a journalist. And then, more recently, the last 9 years with his wife as partner in successful restaurants.
And a fabulous restaurant. We will never forget that wonderful dinner in Beijing.
Right. Well, now there are Susus, the Vietnamese one you've been to. There are now, I think, 5 Susu locations and 3 of the Thai branch, which is called Pak Pak. And it's been very enriching for our lives. But I think that the history that went into the Lost Torah of Shanghai, I had started to research possibly even before he went as a student. I mean, even in the early 90s, because being a student and interested in Jewish history, I sometimes became interested in Jewish history in places where you don't expect it. And I don't know I don't really remember the timing, but whether it was before China became such an integral part of my life or not, I got interested in the history of the fact that before the communists in Shanghai, there were different streams of Jews living there, different settlements of Jews who really maintained a regular Jewish community like we had in this country, or as there were in Europe until there weren't. And I don't know if you remember, in 2010, the Asian Art Museum had Shanghai 2010 had an exhibit, and there was in San Francisco, and there was an entire year of events and exhibits and concerts that other organizations collaborated with the Asian Art Museum. And I was very active in an organization called the American Jewish Committee. I was on the board of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter. And we brought an exhibit to San Francisco that was called Jews in Modern China, which was 1840 to 1949. That was modern China, that had already been at the Simon Wiesenthal Museum of Tolerance in LA. And it was sponsored actually by a cultural arm of the Chinese government, sort of the equivalent of the National Endowment for the Arts or Humanities. And it was somewhat of a, weird mixture of photographs that I've later heard they had no rights to the credits to, but as we all know, welcome to China. And and that exhibit came, and I was the coordinator of it. It was at the Presidio, at the first redoing of the Officers Club before the next one, where they had a really lovely exhibit space. And it was all flat, but because they're in the space, there are display cases. And because there were so many former Shanghai landers and people from Shanghai, from the Jewish communities of Shanghai, I had put a piece in the Jewish News asking for people to contribute any mementos or private personal things that they were willing to have exhibit that we could borrow. And I ended up, schlepping around in the car to all sorts of places in the Bay Area, picking things up from people who either themselves or their families had been representative of one of those 3 streams. And most people, the story that's most known is of the refugees who came from Europe to escape the Holocaust. And Shanghai was a place you could get in without a visa. And, obviously doors were closed to them all over the world, including the United States. Quotas were, huge. And so, but that is the most known story. But welcoming them there were two other groups. One was the Baghdadi Jews, names like Sassoon, Hardoon, very wealthy, originally opium traders, Jews who came from Baghdad, and then ultimately went to India, many of them, and came to Hong Kong and Shanghai for business reasons, way early, about 1840. And they were in a very well-off community. You've probably been to the Peace Hotel in Shanghai.
Gorgeous, and yes.
Which was
And
built
to me,
by,
not to interrupt, but I'm so glad to hear you mention it, because when people, now maybe I think tourism will return to China. I hope so. I love the country as you do. And people always say, where do you stay in Shanghai? And I said, there are more glamorous hotels and more modern hotels, but to me, there's only one, the Fairmont Peace Hotel.
right.
Talk about the significance of that place.
Well, it still is a Fairmont, so it's not so terrible. I mean,
No.
it's a lot more glamorous now than it was the first time I saw it in the year 2000, before Fairmont took it over. The Fairmont Hotel was built by Victor Sassoon, who was part of one of these, fabulous first families of the Jewish community of Shanghai. And Shanghai itself was known as the Paris of what they used to call the Orient. In the 20s, the 30s, it was a fabulous cosmopolitan place where, writers wrote some of the most famous books, and, and people had a very, fabulous life, really like being in Paris, but in the other side of the world, before the war, before the communists. And of course, there was an enormous amount of corruption and civil war, but, there was really quite a fabulous life to be led, probably unless you were Chinese, but those groups were very much part of it. So they were there. In addition, there was a whole group of Russian Jews that had come through Siberia to escape the Tsars and the Russian Revolution, roughly at the same time that my family came from Russia and Poland to this country in the early 1900s. And some of them landed in a place called Harbin, which is further north. I've been there too. And then that was the first area attacked by the Japanese in the 1930s. And then many of them moved down to Shanghai and also Tianjin, which is not that far from from Beijing. So there were really the Russian Jews, who mainly lived in the really beautiful, my favorite, French Concession area, and the Baghdadi Jews, who were pretty much in the international concession, were there to provide a social safety net for the Jews who came from Europe, really to the port of last resort, which Shanghai was for them.
It's fascinating, the history of Shanghai in general, but for the Jewish community, I think it's something that a lot of us non-Jews are not familiar of, and I wasn't until your book. That's why I find it so fascinating. It's a historic thriller and a missing piece of Jewish history. In our last few minutes, I want to talk to you about something else we've been discussing the last few days since we've been in contact to set this up. And that's a film I saw recently that I couldn't believe I missed when it first came out, the movie Denial.
Right.
You recently revealed to me an interesting personal connection to that movie and something that's about to take place. Talk to me about that.
All right. Well, Denial is the really not so fictionalized version of a libel case against Professor Deborah Lipstadt, who has been at Emory University for many years. Deborah Lipstadt is a real hero among Jewish scholars. I've heard her speak many times and for many organizations wherever I've lived around the country, including here last fall, and she's terrific. And she was sued she wrote a book or a piece, related to a British Holocaust denier. And in Britain, you can sue for libel. And she was forced to go on trial in London, as you've just seen the movie. And she's played by Rachel Weisz, which even she admits, was pretty flattering. And she won. But it was a grueling time. I'm not exactly sure. I can't remember. She's written a book about it too, how she raised the money for the legal defense. I mean, it was very, very difficult time, but it was very important. It was a very important case in that he lost, and Holocaust denial was in that case proved to be fake news.
So, but there's an event coming up where Dr. Lipstadt is about to speak, correct?
Yes, she's speaking because she's in Georgia, and because the political center of the world is now becoming Georgia, and with the runoff race for the two seats, Senate seats in Georgia, an organization, part of what we've all just been involved in the campaign, a silo of the Biden-Harris campaign is called Jewish Women for Joe. And that is an organization, I mean, to some degree, I mean, we've been on Zooms, and, and I have one credit card that I've given political donations to that next month is going to have a breather. But, and living in Wisconsin, believe me, it's been really stressful. And so now all eyes are turned to Georgia, and she and I think a member of the African American community in Atlanta are speaking on anti-Semitism and anti-Black Lives Matter, for lack of a better word, on Monday, as not a fundraiser, but as an informative event sponsored by Jewish Women for Joe, because the national campaign is remaining active in this race, as are the local candidates there, and Stacey Abrams, Get Out the Vote, anti-voter suppression organization. Everybody, if you've given 5 cents to anything in the last year towards the Democratic cause, you're getting emails. You're still getting emails all about Georgia. But I'm very pleased that you are going to join this. I think you'll find Deborah Lipstadt to be really thoughtful and very articulate. I mean, she's really a scholar, and she's really somebody that we're very happy to showcase.
One of my favorite Saturday rituals is to watch either documentaries or historic fiction. And somehow I stumbled just last week upon Denial, and I had never seen it, and I was stunned somehow that I missed it. We've only got a few minutes left, so talk to me about what is next for Linda Frank. And by next, I mean, what's your next book?
Well, my developmental editor, who's somebody who works out, Alan Rinsler, who's a real veteran in the publishing world, who works out of Berkeley, and I were talking about it several months ago, and I really thought, there may or may not be one. There may be one related to the diamond industry stemming out of Amsterdam, but because there's some interesting stories about Jews there during the war. But he said, what about Lily, my main character, the prequel? Like before, she was a widow, and before she started into all this, and maybe her developmental years, starting in England after she came on the kinder transport. And I began to think about that. And another real life character that has begun to interest me is a woman named Lily Montague, who was a social justice advocate, and actually an advocate for liberal Judaism, what we call in this country reform, which was very and wrote and had positions that in the early 20th century that were very unusual for women in Britain at the time. And so I've just ordered a pile of books related to her, and there may be something Lily and Lily, but it probably will not be titled that way, because underneath it all, I am really an incredible Anglophile, and and hoping I can spend a month in London, researching this, or finishing it off, or authenticating it before maybe this next year is over, when we can all get planes and go places.
Yeah. Well, when you get to London, I'm an Anglophile as well. I'll introduce you to two of my upcoming guests who now both live in London. Lucinda Hawksley, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens, who is a wonderful biographer and author herself. And of course, my long-term friend, now living in London with his husband, Christopher Turner, Armistead Maupin. And all three of you have been very generous with your reviews of my book. So I thank you.
Thank you. And I will be generous, and I will hold them up as soon as I get one. Hold your book up and show you where I'm reading it, even though I read the galley copy.
I appreciate it. The final has many less typos, so please read it. We've been speaking with Linda Frank, author of The Nice Little Blonde Girl, the Jewish Miss Marple, The Lost Torah of Shanghai, and After the Auction. It's been a great pleasure, Linda. I look forward to speaking with
Thank
you again
you.
soon.
Thank you so much, and see you maybe in a couple months.
I hope so. Ahoy.
Thank you. Best to Alfredo.